Hello everyone, I am Dr. Vibhash Vaidya, and today in this video we'll discuss about the rest part of the Norma Basalis. So today our topic is the posterior part of the Norma Basalis. So let's see in the details. You can see here, this is the inferior view of skull, and we'll discuss about the posterior part of the Norma Basalis. And the posterior part of the Norma Basalis extend from the anterior margin of the foramen magnum to the superior nuchal line. First, we'll see the structure which present on the median area. After then, we'll see the structure present on the lateral area. So the median area shows from before to backward. You can see here this large foramen, and this large foramen is called foramen magnum. Then you can see here a crest is present, and this crest is called external occipital crest. Then you can see here a protuberance, and this protuberance is called external occipital protuberance and nuchal line. So these are the features which present on the median area of the posterior part of the Norma Basalis. So first we'll discuss about the foramen magnum. You can see here a large foramen. This foramen is called foramen magnum, and it open upward into the posterior cranial fossa. You can see here this is the posterior cranial fossa, and this foramen magnum which open upward into this posterior cranial fossa and downward into the vertebral canal. It is oval in shape. You can see here the foramen magnum is a oval in shape, being wider behind than in front, where it is overlap on the each side by a occipital condyle. You can see here on the each side of the foramen magnum, here you can see a condyle, and this condyle is called occipital condyle, and this foramen magnum which overlap with this condyles. Now the external occipital crust, you can see here a longitudinal crust, and this crust is called external occipital crust, and this external occipital crust begin at the posterior margin of the foramen magnum. You can see here from here this external occipital crust is begin and end posteriorly above by the occipital protuberance. The external occipital protuberance is a projection located at the posterior end of the crust, and it is easily felt in the living in the midline at the point where the back of the neck become continuous with the scalp. So this structure is called external occipital protuberance. Now the nuchal line. You can see here a lateral going ridges-like structure, and this structure is called nuchal line. The superior nuchal line begin at the external occipital protuberance. You can see here this nuchal line is called superior nuchal line, and the inferior nuchal line at the mid of the crust. You can see here at the mid of the external occipital crust, here you can see another nuchal line, and this nuchal line is called inferior nuchal line. So we have superior nuchal line which begin from the external occipital crust, and inferior nuchal line which begin at the mid of the external occipital crust. You may observe both of them curve laterally and backward, and then laterally and forward. Then highest nuchal line is fade and seen above the superior nuchal line. You can see occasionally here another nuchal line you can observe here, and this nuchal line is called highest nuchal line which present occasionally. So this is the structure present on the median area of the posterior part of the Norma Basalis. Now we'll discuss about the structure present on the lateral area of the posterior part of the Norma Basalis. So the lateral area shows the condylar part of the occipital bone. You can see here this is the condylar part of the occipital bone. Then the squamous part of the occipital bone. Here we have a squamous part of the occipital bone. Then the jugular foramen. You can see here this foramen is called jugular foramen, and this jugular foramen present in between the occipital and the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Along with this, you can see here a styloid process of the temporal bone and the mastoid part of the temporal bone. So these are the structure which present on the lateral area. So we'll discuss one by one. First, the condylar or lateral part of the occipital bone. So this is the condylar or lateral part of the occipital bone, which present the following feature. First, the occipital condyle. You can see here, this condyle is called occipital condyle. The occipital condyle are oval in shape and are situated on the each side of anterior margin of the foramen magnum. Their long axis is directed forward and medially. You can observe the long axis of this condyle is forward and medially. And this condyle, which articulate with the superior articular facet of the atlas vertebra to form the atlanto-occipital joint. Then you can see here a canal, and this canal is called hypoglossal or anterior condylar canal, which pierces the bone anterior superiorly to the occipital condyle, and it is directed laterally and slightly forwards. The posteriorly you can see here another canal, and this canal is called condylar or posterior condylar canal. It is occasionally present in the floor of the condylar fossa, present behind the occipital condyle. Superiorly it is open into the sigmoid sulcus. Then you can see here this process is called jugular process of the occipital bone. Lies lateral to the occipital condyle. Just lateral to this occipital condyle. Here this process is called jugular process of the occipital bone, and it forms the posterior boundary of the jugular foramen. This is the jugular foramen. Now the jugular foramen. You can see here a large and elongated with its long axis directed forward and medially. Here a foramen is visible, and this foramen is called jugular foramen. It is placed at the posterior end of the petrous occipital suture. You can see here, this is the petrous occipital suture, and the posterior margin of this petrous occipital suture, here a foramen is present, and this foramen is called the jugular foramen. At the posterior end of the foramen, the anterior wall of the petrous temporal bone, you can see here, this structure is hollowed out to form the jugular fossa. You can see this hollowed out is form the jugular fossa, and this jugular fossa which lodge the superior valve of the internal jugular vein. When you compare these two jugular fossa, the right jugular fossa is large than the left one. You can see here the lateral wall of the jugular fossa. This is the lateral wall of the jugular fossa, and this lateral wall is pierced by the mastoid canaliculus. This is the mastoid canaliculus. Then you can see here on the medial end of the jugular foramen. This is the medial end of the jugular foramen. Here you can see a notch, and this notch is called the jugular notch. At the apex of the notch, you can see here, this is the apex of the notch, and this notch is an opening that lead into the Cochlear canaliculus. So this is called Cochlear canaliculus. Then the tympanic canaliculus. You can see here, this canaliculus is called tympanic canaliculus, and this tympanic canaliculus open on the near the edge of the bone between the jugular fossa and lower end of the carotid canal. Here this canaliculus is called tympanic canaliculus. This process is called styloid process. In between this styloid process and mastoid process, here you can see another foramen, and this foramen is called stylomastoid foramen, which situated posterior to the root of the styloid process. This is the root of the styloid process, and the anterior of the mastoid process. This is the mastoid process, or anterior to the mastoid process. Here this foramen is called stylomastoid foramen. Then the mastoid process. Here a brush-like process, and this process is called mastoid process. It is a large conical projection located posterior to the stylomastoid foramen. This is the stylomastoid foramen, and just posterior to this stylomastoid foramen, here this large conical projection is called mastoid process, and it is directed downward and forward, and it forms the lateral wall of the mastoid notch. You can see here this notch is called the mastoid notch. So this is all about the posterior part of the Norma Basalis. I hope all of you understood the topic. Thank you.